Until the Second World War, Canada's relationship with its Arctic territories and the Inuit who lived there had largely been one of indifference. Inuit were subjected to intermittent interests as subjects of ethnographic study and partners in the fur trade, but little more. This changed in the 1950s as Canadian politicians, antsy with Cold War anxiety, started seeing the North through the lens of sovereignty and national security. This documentary will explore what happened to Inuit communities, people, and constitutional orders as the Arctic came to be seen by colonial governments as a domain of international competition and was subsumed by the blind logic of war.
Here on the southern tip of Baffin Island, like other once remote isolated points, the increased tempo of development brought the white man in large numbers with incredible machines and shattered the calm of the silent North.
Canada's nation-building campaigns in the North were supported by the federal government's media production branches, including the National Film Board, or NFB. During the Cold War, the NFB produced many propaganda films about the Canadian Arctic, espousing the virtues of Canada's air defense systems, its development of infrastructure on the northern landscape, and its programs to assimilate Inuit people into the settler Canadian nation. In the 1990s, the NFB started to fund more films produced by the Inuit and other Indigenous groups, which were more critical of Canada's colonial activity, such as 1995's Broken Promises, the High Arctic Relocation. This short documentary will use footage from both eras of NFB filmmaking, juxtaposing the narratives presented by the colonial authorities and the people they sought to subjugate. The film will also draw from the final report of the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, an Inuit-led inquiry into the impacts of colonialism on the Inuit during the Cold War. The Second World War came to an end after the newly invented atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The front lines of the war froze instantly, drawing borders across territory occupied by the formerly Allied powers of the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, led by the United States. One of these lines crossed the Arctic lands and waters of the Inuit. Before long, the Soviets had developed their own bomb. Atomically armed intercontinental bombers circled the North Pole, ready for the order that would send them beelining south to their targets. The Cold War had begun.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength. And there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness.
In the early 1950s, a series of thermonuclear tests made the American administration realize that radioactive fallout was a more serious problem than they had previously thought. If one hydrogen bomb was detonated over New York City, millions would be exposed to fatal radiation doses. This revelation prompted the United States to build the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, across the high Arctic to detect enemy aircraft crossing the Arctic Circle. The Dew Line was a series of radar stations that would provide a 2-hour warning of Soviet bombers flying over the Arctic before they reached the continental United States. It was composed of 63 sites stretching across 400 kilometers from Alaska to Iceland. Canada and the United States had signed the Ogdensburg Agreement in 1940, which stated that the two countries took joint responsibility for the defense of North America as a whole. This meant that the United States had grounds to flood Canadian territory with troops and materials in the name of continental defense. Construction of the radar stations, coordinated by the American and Canadian Air Forces, was a massive undertaking. Construction involved 23,000 workers, 45,000 plane loads of equipment, and 284 million liters of fuel. The influx of Southern workers and the material goods they brought dramatically changed the economic, social, and environmental landscape of the Arctic. Before the mid-20th century, Canadians in the South generally thought of the Arctic as a combination of virginal wilderness and barren tundra, attached to the nation but not inhabited by it. In the Cold War context, this no man's land became a defensive liability, one that could be occupied by enemy forces. These feared enemy forces initially took the shape of the Soviet Union, but as more and more American troops and hardware populated the North, Canadian anxieties started to suspect their allies of plotting a northern land grab.
This is the Arctic Ocean, seen from the Canadian side.
In her 2017 article, Canada Under the Dew Line, Canadian scholar Rebecca Campbell described how powers often use the borders drawn by defensive lines, like the Dew Line, to signal what they considered to be their territory, and Canada used the opportunity to assert its ownership of the high Arctic.
This is Canada's last frontier, and men are moving north to pioneer it. Military survey crews range across the bleak terrain, making new maps, improving old ones, and changing an unknown land into a completely charted part of the Canadian nation.
In spite of Canada's efforts to integrate the Arctic into an extension of the Canadian South, the United States perceived the North as a battleground, a so-called waste area meant to absorb the damage of a nuclear exchange, keeping fallout away from the American heartland. All the same, Canadian romanticization of the North as a pristine national backyard made the imagined threat of American forces staking a claim to the Arctic more pressing for Canadian voters, newspapers, and politicians. The ultimate show of sovereignty was a settled population, and Ottawa needed to create one to broadcast that the North was an intrinsic part of the nation.
Pond Inlet will one day become a major Arctic community, lying midway between the extensive natural gas reserves of the Queen Elizabeth Islands.
Before 1950, the Inuit residents of the high Arctic lived as they had for generations, living in small family kinship groups.
In those days, we did not depend entirely on the Hudson's Bay. We were living out of the land, much more than we were getting our supplies. We used to go to the Hudson's Bay store to get a flour, tea, those little things. But they were not our main food. We survived from the land. We've been surviving from the land for centuries.
In 1939, a legal ruling decided that the definition of Indians in Section 91 of the Constitution Act included Inuit, meaning the federal rather than provincial government had jurisdiction over them. Ottawa started looking for alleged solutions for the welfare of their so-called northern citizens. When the prices of furs took a downturn post-World War II, the federal government used the pretext of welfare for Inuit trappers who had lost income to start intruding more into Inuit lives.
I first heard about the relocation when the police came by dog team with an interpreter and told us we were leaving. He told my older brother and his wife's family, "There are many animals at the new location and that is why you are leaving." I will never forget his words. He said that whenever we felt like returning home, we could, and he made it sound very attractive.
The families were relocated thousands of kilometers north to the high Arctic, where local conditions soon showed that government concerns for Inuit welfare were not the primary motivation for the resettlements.
They dumped us like dogs. There was little light, and the weather was already cold. They moved us to a barren land in front of a big mountain. We didn't have any supplies.
Relocatees were told they'd be provided with housing, food, running water, and other necessities of life, none of which were in place when they arrived. The RCMP's promise that they could return home if they chose was not honored, and relocated Inuit were subject to constant RCMP surveillance. One of the new communities at Grise Fjord was beside an American Air Force base. Ottawa needed a permanent population to remind the Americans who the Arctic really belonged to. This resettlement program has since been referred to as the Human Flagpoles Project. To understand the process of colonization, it is helpful to understand the concept of constitutional orders. A constitutional order is a framework for the operation of law in a community. Constitutional orders go deeper than a written code. It is a set of presumptions about reality and existence, which inform the values and objectives of its laws and legal practices. In his PhD dissertation, Anishinaabe legal scholar Aaron Mills described how constitutional orders are generated within independent ecosystems of logic and structure, and it is impossible to translate them across the gaps between those ecosystems without losing their true meaning.
They developed no system of chiefs or leaders with authority over the group.
A law or legal practice from one constitutional order may not be recognized as a law or legal practice by someone from the outside. When one constitutional order has power over another to create and manage the framework that the second constitutional order operates in, the latter cannot operate its own laws, only mistranslated shadows of them, distorted beyond meaning to fit into the structure of the dominant constitutional order. Mills refers to this process as constitutional capture. Constitutional capture was a prominent force in the rise of the Canadian settler state, as European ways of thinking approached Indigenous worldviews with a presumed superiority, leading to two-dimensional perceptions of deeply nuanced values and teachings. In her 2012 article, Placing Economies, Lessons from the Inuit About Economics, Time, and Existence, Professor Nicole Gombe describes what she refers to as the economy of place. In Inuit communities, the importance of hunting, fishing, and trapping encourages a cyclical understanding of time because people are immersed in ecological cycles. The Arctic environment can change rapidly, resulting in a worldview that is less likely to understand time and place as permanently fixed and predictable, and is conscious of a constant state of flow. Paradoxically, this constant state of flow encourages people to live in the present. In contrast, colonial officials came from a society that fought against the flow of time, attempting to control future outcomes with systems like stock markets and insurance companies. Gombe refers to this mindset as the imperialism of probabilities, which sought to deny the limits imposed by the universe and, quote, colonize the future. Colonial authorities applied their Eurocentric conceptions of progress to label Inuit economies and constitutional orders as primitive and set about dismantling them. For example, in Inuit culture, names are conceived of as vessels for the bearer's spirit, or atik. Newborns inherit the atik of a deceased person, and the two become saunik, namesakes who are spiritually linked together. The relationships between saunik transcend the limitations of Western understandings of gender and family relations. When colonial authorities encountered Inuit naming conventions, they forcibly assigned Inuit with Western-style first and last names, breaking the cycle of the Atik and replacing it with a simple system of identification. The violent breaking of intergenerational memory and practice was part of a wider agenda of forced assimilation, enabled by an understanding of naming constrained to Western constitutional orders.
The Eskimos do not yet think as we do. They look with nostalgia to the life of the hunter, the old way. But they feel a subconscious sense of security in the new way. Over here, we're going to build a nursing station. And further along the gravel ridge where the 2 tents stand, we will build a 2-room school.
The federal government incentivized Inuit to move to designated communities with false promises of affordable housing. Many of these communities happened to be close to military installations like the Dew Line.
The Eskimos seem unconcerned with the impact that the new strip will have on the lifestyle of their community. No longer do they walk the tightrope of survival during the extreme winters. They welcome the new security. But the 20th century has arrived, and the northern people are a part of it.
Construction and maintenance of military infrastructure was expected to create jobs for the Inuit and replace the local land-based economy. However, there were not enough jobs to sustain the relocated people. Settlement location criteria prioritized sea and plain access over hunting and fishing grounds, meaning Inuit were removed from sources of subsistence. Many became dependent on state welfare as a result. Before 1950, there were over 100 identified places where Inuit lived in the Baffin region alone. By 1975, almost all of the Inuit in the area had been collected into 13 permanent settlements established by the federal government. Communities struggled when they were grouped together in hamlets much larger than the size of the groups they had formerly lived with. Having strangers for neighbors was a drastic change for their communities of kinship groups, and social controls broke down as community dynamics were thrown off. In the settlements, Inuit laws and customs were not respected. Everyone was expected to conform to Western social norms, and the Inuits' dependence that Southern institutions had cultivated meant that they were subject to paternalistic attitudes and policies.
They provide a source of inexpensive local labor, quick to pick up imitative skills.
These initiatives to transform the Inuit way of life were sudden and absolute, with no process of transition and no consultation with the Inuit whatsoever.
Why, that's a long time. Which would you rather be doing, hunting and trapping or working at the base?
I think better to hunt.
Hunting better. Do you get much chance to go out hunting now?
No.
Not very much. How about you, Jacoby? Which would you rather doing?
Oh, but hunt.
The 1973 National Film Board production, Labrador North, which documented relocated Inuit in the community of Nain, Labrador, demonstrates how constitutional capture affected local governance. Committees always followed confusing Western procedures and principles, and were not accommodating to Inuit laws, so Inuit voices were often not heard.
It's all outsiders. They have camps on, I think, the best rivers in Labrador. There's more or less just the scraps left.
That's why councils to sit down and work hard, learn themselves the function of council, and you can yourselves break down the system you're complaining about. You follow it?
Life has already changed greatly for the Caribou Eskimo people. Once nomadic, they were settled here by the federal government in 1959. Given a choice, few would return to the hardships and insecurity of following the caribou. These happy children will feel the full impact of the changes the airstrip will superimpose on their parents' way of life. With schooling and training, the adjustment is made easier, and the Eskimo people of the future will be able to have the best of both worlds.
Schooling in the communities was designed to create a generational gap that resulted in the loss of cultural teachings, values, beliefs, and skills. The curriculum typically had nothing to do with life in the North and was exclusively taught in English.
That they spoke Inuktitut again, they were forced to eat a bar of soap. It made them throw up for 2-3 days. And they were told that is because you spoke of an evil language that we were no longer supposed to speak.
Reports from American bases started describing worsening health conditions among relocated Inuit. The bad publicity embarrassed Ottawa into providing health care. Even this served as a state tool of assimilation.
A new Canadian citizen is registered in the Mounties office.
A medical patrol ship, the C.D. Howe, screened and detained sick people without explaining what was going on and shipped them south to hospitals for months or years.
When I had to leave for the hospital, I was scared. I didn't want to leave my family, but I wanted to get well. Many of our families had to spend a great deal of time in the hospital. So a lot of us grew up without the care of our mothers. Most of us children were motherless one way or another.
Pediatric patients, separated from their families, were seriously abused in the hospitals, and their records were often lost, leading them to be discharged in random communities without notification to their families. Children were sometimes forcibly adopted by hospital staff, and the families of those who died in care were often never notified. There is a deep relationship between sled dogs and a hunter. Dogs pull sleds, fetch game, protect families against predators, navigate through storms, and test sea ice for cracks. The dogs had a difficult time adapting to settlement life, where there were exponentially more strange people and dogs. When dogs inevitably got stressed out by this situation and got into conflicts with one another, the RCMP response was to put them down. Many hunters who had their dogs killed were effectively imprisoned in settlements. Snowmobiles were eventually brought in as replacements, but by this point many skilled hunters had passed away without teaching their skills to the next generation. Today, many Inuit characterize the killings as a strategy for curbing their self-reliance. A legal ruling in 1959 decided that Inuit were exempt from the Indian Act provision that prohibited sale of liquor to Indians. This resulted in alcohol pouring into settlements. Many Inuit drank in response to the trauma and pain of the relocations. This resulted in predictable preaching from government officials who said drunkenness was a moral deficiency, and authorities did little to restrict the import of liquor.
People started drinking, and I guess they got to drink more and more, and then they would say, there's another place where we used to live. They used to tell me that, but I couldn't really believe them. Sometimes from one house to another, we would be running away from fightings or drunks, and then we would go to another family, and there'd just be kids there and nobody else taking care of them. And
you would wake up intoxicated parents entering, and you want to sleep, but you can't. It was depressing. I mean, not fun at all.
I guess the people at the base started to realize they could take advantage of this, that they could bring down the booze and womanize. It was never during the daytime. Like, it was like a hush-hush sort of.
Just as Ottawa's security needs were blind to the realities of the Indigenous people who found themselves on the front lines of the Cold War, so too did it roll over the land with little regard for its well-being. Gear was dumped haphazardly over the years, causing leakage of toxic chemicals into the environment. Pollution in the north breaks down slowly because of freezing temperatures and the lack of sunlight. Many contaminants from abandoned radar sites, including asbestos and toxic chemicals, continued to leak decades after the sites were shut down. Contaminants stick to animal fat, bioaccumulating as they move through the food chain. Toxins and carcinogens have been found in the systems of animals that Inuit rely on for food, including caribou, trout, and others. The DEW line became operational in 1957, just in time to become obsolete as intercontinental ballistic missile technology replaced bomber planes as the preferred way to use nuclear weapons. By 1963, more than half of the 42 stations in Canada had been abandoned, and the last station shuttered in 1993.
In Inuit terms, Qikqtani Inuit are seeking peace with past opponents.
The festivities proclaim the first new subdivision of Canada's political map in 50 years. 19 new lawmakers, many of them inexperienced, assume control over 20% of the nation's vast land.
This was achieved through peaceful negotiations, without civil disobedience, without litigation.
Today, Nunavut's territorial government functions using a set of principles known as Inuit-Canadian Encounters, or IQ, built into their procedures and policies. In her book, The Politics of Naming in the Arctic, author and journalist Valerie Alia describes IQ as family kinship values that have been linked to modern realities to function as guidance for government decision-making. Examples of IQ principles include consensus-based decision-making, serving others, environmental stewardship, and collaboration.
I have watched with great admiration and respect as the people of Nunavut have assumed more and more authority.
Although Nunavut is still under the jurisdiction of the federal government and is captive to its constitutional framework, the use of IQ in the territorial government creates space for its preservation and revitalization among those who know how to use it. In 2005, the federal government tasked the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with investigating their alleged murder of sled dogs.
The QIA was deeply disappointed with the RCMP report, which rejected Inuit memories and was disrespectful of Inuit elders. More importantly, the QIA believed that the RCMP report missed an opportunity to heal the relations between Inuit and the government authorities.
The investigation denied the slaughter took place, prompting the creation of the Inuit-led Qikqtani Truth Commission.
Well, the Commission's mandate was to look at what happened in that period of Canada's history from 1950 to 1975 in the Eastern Arctic. It was a period of transition, not only for Inuit, but also a period of transition for Canada. So Inuit had lived a nomadic life and then moved into the settlements, and the Commission looked at why and how that happened, and the role of the government in that process, and the effects and consequences of those policies and those decisions on Inuit.
The Commission interviewed 350 witnesses and reviewed documents from the Cold War period regarding 13 communities in the Qikqtani or Baffin Island region.
What we want to do is to offer some guideposts for Chalunat, in other words, non-Inuits, and Inuit peoples in the delivery of government systems to communities. How can you learn from past mistakes?
The Commission will contribute to the healing process by developing recommendations that will promote reconciliation. These recommendations are grouped in 4 subject areas: acknowledgement and healing of the past wrongs, strengthening Inuit governance, strengthening Inuit culture, and creating healthy communities.
The Government of Canada starts by simply saying, we acknowledge this history and we are sincerely sorry.
In 2010, the federal government announced a funded partnership to, quote, build a long-term and sustainable response to the Qikqtani Truth Commission's findings and recommendations. Canada's fleeting security needs in the mid-20th century completely changed the trajectory of history for the Inuit. The Cold War created a security interest in the Inuit homeland as the global split between East and West cut through the Arctic. The resulting American military presence in the North made Canada nervous and led them to take action to assert their proclaimed sovereignty within a militarized context. This assertion resulted in constitutional capture, in which Inuit lives came to be seen through the lens of Canada's sovereignty and security agenda. Much of constitutional capture is inherently invisible to people outside the captive constitutional order, as that order's very existence is only visible to the people who were raised in it and have the lens needed to make sense of its forms. Once that lens is gone due to broken links in a constitutional order's intergenerational memory, the perceived object's true meaning is lost in translation forever. That was the ultimate goal of Canada's assimilation policies, which sought to break connections between Inuit and their land, their ancestors, and one another. Inuit are now piecing together stories and initiating healing for their communities and land. It is the responsibility of settler Canadians to support this healing and to remember how the runaway escalation of interstate hostility leads colonial governments to violently and carelessly uproot Indigenous people in the name of security interests.
The Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the global average, opening up new shipping lanes and revealing a treasure trove of natural resources. And there are fears that if Canada doesn't assert its presence and ownership of this region, another country will.
Canada claims jurisdiction over the Northwest Passage, but that ownership is challenged by the U.S. and others. As Russia slips away from diplomatic ties, its military forces are expanding. In February, Russian bombers flew over the Bering Sea, close to Alaska and Canada's borders.
If Russia were ever to attack North America, the shortest route would be from the North Pole.
When will this government stand up to Putin and defend our Arctic sovereignty?
Canada is also purchasing 15 new warships to work in tandem with its 6 icebreakers.
Kenny says Operation Noble Defender has been in the planning for months and isn't a direct response to the war in Ukraine, where Arctic security is on the minds of many Canadians. In its last budget, the federal government committed $252 million towards modernizing NORAD and supporting continental defense capabilities over